Shop Readings.
Should women teach Christian doctrine to men in the church? People who argue they should not often cite 1 Corinthians 14:34-35 to support their position. The women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. By all appearances, Paul is telling the women in the church at Corinth to refrain from speaking in the church. The question is, why? Two lines of interpretation have been proposed. One says that Paul silenced the women at the church in Corinth because being a woman in itself requires silence in the church. The other view says that Paul silenced the women at the church in Corinth not because they were women per se, but because there was something about their speaking that was disruptive to the worship service. According to this understanding of the verse, Paul is here correcting disruptive behavior, and it just so happened that it was the women who needed correcting as opposed to the men. Which line of interpretation is better? Most interpreters would agree that absolute silence cannot be Paul's final word for the Corinthian women, for this would negate what Paul explicitly allows in 1 Corinthians 11, just a few chapters before. There, Paul instructs the Corinthians that when women pray and prophesy in the church, they should do so with their heads properly covered. Therefore, Paul must be prohibiting women from a certain act or kind of speaking in the church. Thus, some have suggested the following. Since Paul must be prohibiting a certain kind of speaking in the church, not all speaking, it must be that he only wanted women to be silent with respect to teaching and preaching roles in the church, especially when men are among the listeners. However, there is nothing in the text itself that can lead one to conclude that the Corinthians would have understood Paul to be prohibiting women only from the role of teacher or preacher. In fact, 1 Corinthians 14 does not mention teaching and preaching at all. Further, Paul does not say that women should be silent only if men are present. He simply says they should be silent, gender of the listeners notwithstanding. Why assume that Paul is telling women not to teach and preach when nothing in the text hints in that direction? Such guesswork might be warranted if Paul had never mentioned a specific act of speaking in these verses. But of course, this is not the case. Verse 35 says, "If there is anything they, the women, desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church." The only speaking act Paul mentions in this passage with reference to these women is question asking. Ironically, there is actually no mention of teaching here at all.
Excuse me, class.
The women
Class.
appear instead to be filling the role of students. The only act of speaking that is explicitly mentioned is question asking, which is most naturally the activity of a learner, not an instructor. These observations pose an obvious interpretive problem for those who read this passage as restricting women from filling teaching and preaching roles in the church. These readers claim that 1 Corinthians 14:34-35 is about gender roles. But as we have observed, the only role this text suggests the women in Corinth were filling was that of a learner or student, not an instructor or teacher. But no Christian in his right mind could conclude that women should not fill the role of a learner in the church due to their gender. What about the second line of interpretation? Does this view fare any better? Yes, much better. First, this interpretation flows much more naturally from the theme of the preceding verses. The Greek word sigao, here translated keep silent, only appears 4 times in Paul's writings, and 3 out of those 4 are here in 1 Corinthians 14. Here, Paul tells 3 groups of people to be quiet. He addresses the first group in verses 27-28. If any speak in a tongue, let there be only 2 or at most 3, and each in turn, and let someone interpret. But if there is no one to interpret, let each of them keep silent in church and speak to himself and to God. Notice that in these verses, Paul is correcting disorderly behavior. The following verses, 29-30, share the same goal of orderliness in worship. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others weigh what is said. If a revelation is made to another sitting there, let the first be silent. Verse 33 says, "For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace." Now, If verse 34 is actually about silencing women simply because they are women, Paul is abruptly changing his line of thought. Instead of continuing with his concern for orderliness in worship through verse 34, Paul, in this view, is quite suddenly changing the subject to gender roles. Of course, it is possible for Paul to have done this, and if there were no plausible alternative interpretation on offer, one might have to conclude that this is what Paul has done. But such is not the case, for the second line of interpretation does make good sense of the context. This interpretation says that Paul silenced these women for the same reason he silenced the other two groups of people in the verses immediately preceding. On this view, Paul did not silence them simply because they were women, but because the way or the timing in which they were choosing to speak was out of order. Just as Paul silenced those who were speaking in tongues in a disorderly way in verses 27 and 28, and those who were prophesying in a disorderly way in verses 29 and 30, so he silences this group of women for the same reason. The question then arises, why didn't Paul want these women to ask questions in church? This is a difficult question to answer. After all, 1 Corinthians is a letter, which means we only have one side of the conversation. But it is important to note that introducing gender roles to this text does not help to answer the question in the least. Contrary to what some interpreters have claimed, 1 Corinthians 14:34 and 35 is about correcting a problem of disorder in the Corinthian church. It does not limit the ministry of all women in the church due to their gender.
Sharp readings.